Hello, everyone. Welcome into Above My Pay Grade. My name is Eric. A lot of news happening in macro today. One thing in particular I wanted to cover was the Bank of England pivoting. Uh, really interesting because those of us who are paying attention realize that all of these gains in the stock market were fueled by debt. And as central banks around the world try to fight inflation by raising rates, all that debt that's in the stock market, all that debt that's in businesses, and most importantly, governments, they can't afford it. And so we're waiting for something to break and for central banks to pivot, and we have our first pivot, and that is the Bank of England. So let's rewind the clock back just a couple days. Both these stories are from CNBC. This says, London, the first fiscal policy announcement from the new British Prime Minister Liz Truss's government has been met with one of the most pronounced market sell-offs in recent history. What they essentially proposed was a bunch of tax cuts, which, for me, as a, I almost said Keynesian, as an Austrian economist, I love that. However, they were tax cuts funded by debt and not funded by cutting spending, on top of the fact that she wants to basically give people stimmy checks or control the price of energy through government intervention. And that's going to cost about $60 billion or 60 billion pounds. And that tax cut is about 45 billion. All debt. So that debt has to be sold on the open market. And we'll talk about what happened there. So they have this 45 billion in tax cuts that they need to fund through debt, which is selling in the United States case, that would be bonds or treasuries. And this 60 billion in energy support for households. So how are they going to fund this? Selling what they call them in Europe or in England are gilts. What we call them over here is treasuries. But the pound started tanking compared to the dollar. And just today, this is published today, Bank of England intervenes in the bond market after a historic sell-off. So people realizing, because the Bank of England hadn't really started tightening and selling their bonds. Keep in mind, central banks can print money and go into markets and buy things. And so the Central Bank of England had a bunch of treasuries on their books from COVID, and they were going to start selling them on the open market, which would increase supply, and there's not a ton of demand as is. So the market participants saw this, that the Bank of England was going to start selling these treasuries on the open market. They saw that the actual government of England had to sell more treasuries because they're taking on even more debt, and they realized, maybe I don't want to hold something that is backed to this government. So they started selling off their treasuries. Market participants started selling off their treasuries. And what did this lead to? This says, yields in the UK government bonds known as gilts were on course for their sharpest monthly rise since 1957. Keeping in mind, remember, treasuries, government debt, if people don't want to buy them, in order to incentivize buying, they raised the yield. So as demand goes down, yield goes up. As demand goes up, yield goes down. Because if demand's high, why do you need to pay a high yield? So people started selling off, and the yield spiked big time, which caused the Bank of England, remember the infinite money printer, to go in and temporarily start buying government bonds to peg the yield lower. Because if you have a money printer, you have infinite demand for these bonds, which means you can buy them and drop. Remember, interest rates go down as demand goes up. So they manufacture demand by printing money, going into the debt market and buying the debt. Now, I watch a lot of things online on macro and is quantitative easing inflationary, because that's what this is. This is yield curve control. This is third world country type stuff. And a lot of people, you probably notice the stock market today in the United States, that went up too. Because when you see one central bank cave, and all it took was like 2 days for the Central Bank of England or the Bank of England to cave. Most market participants think it's only a matter of time, maybe a couple weeks before other central banks cave and they start the printing all over again. But back to quantitative easing. Is it inflationary? Is it not inflationary? The way I look at it is if a central bank can print money, remember, money, velocity matters. Like where, if you print money and put it and bury it in the backyard, it's as if it never existed because it doesn't have velocity. It didn't go anywhere. But if a central bank prints money and buys government debt, that gives governments more money to spend. And those governments, as I showed you earlier, are spending that in the real economy by either incentivizing or subsidizing energy spending, maybe giving out stimmy checks. So if a central bank buys government debt and that allows the government to spend in the real economy, it is 100% inflationary. Because what should be the brake pedal on governments is their debt burden is becoming too high. And their debt burden becomes too high, meaning the interest goes up too much. They say, we need to stop taking on debt. But if the central bank just prints money and suppresses that interest rate, it doesn't, that brake lever isn't ever pressed. And so, yes, governments go into the real economy and give out real money to real people, and those people spend it. So, further down this article, it says, in line with financial stability objectives, the Bank of England stands ready to restore market functioning and reduce any risk from contagion in credit conditions to UK household and businesses. As of Wednesday, the bank will begin temporary, that's central banker's favorite word, temporary, and Peter Schiff does a good job of analogizing this to a drug addict. The problem is with these central banks, they come in without a free market incentive, because if you can print money, it distorts the market. It distorts the price signals, etc. But then these market participants, other banks, businesses get addicted to this free money. And these temporary programs, remember QE, quantitative easing, was introduced during the great financial crisis, and it was supposed to be temporary. And then we had QE 1, 2, 3, and now it's kind of QE infinity is what most people are expecting. So these temporary programs, the economy gets addicted to it, it causes inflation, and that's what they're saying. They're saying temporary program to restore orderly market conditions, and said they will be carried out on whatever scale necessary to soothe markets. Translation, we will buy everything. If people want to sell bonds or sell gilts, the England's edition of the bond or variation of the bond, if people want to sell them, we'll buy them, because we do not want government debt and the interest payment on that debt to go through the roof. And as I've said over and over again, our 10-year yield in the United States on our government debt, if you want to buy a 10-year treasury, today that dropped through the floor, but it hit about 4%. And we're seeing inflation at 8, 9, government advertised. Who in the right mind would want to buy that? That's not free market. If you're guaranteed to lose 4%, if inflation's at 8 and you're yielding 4 for 10 years, and all that is a contract, there's no variation to it, it's just a contract that guarantees you 4% yield, also known as guaranteed 4% loss, if we're at 8%, who would want to buy that? Who in their right mind would want to buy that? People who are buying it are pensions, and these pensions are feeling it. And they have not adjusted fire yet, but if yields continue to remain negative in relation to inflation, this contagion effect is going to start happening around the world. Is the Federal Reserve next? You guys let me know what you think in the comments below. See you guys in the next one. Peace.